one of the cut lines, the Hamlet priest will say, "Scales are suffering." This, hang on, where is it? Hamlet priest. He says, because Herbert earlier was talking about, there's a line where the Hamlet calls you a messenger from beyond. The other line he says, no, not he says it. The voices that you can hear kind of chanting in the background. One of them says, "Scales are suffering. This is the grief of cause." And like the idea of it being scales sounds strange because what are the scales? Like nothing in Bloodborne has scales. I think that's a reference to when people talk about blindness, they talk about it in terms of scales. Like there's an expression in English that's like, "The scales have fallen from my eyes," meaning I can see clearly now. And it's an archaic way of talking about someone being blind, is that they have scales. So when they're talking about scales are suffering and this is the grief of cause, it's like the scales are the blindness that's being inflicted on the people of Yharnam and the hunters by the vermin. And that's the curse that's been placed upon them.
Do you want to talk about brain fluid?
Talk about brain fluid.
Well, there's this sort of pseudo mold called slime mold. And a certain species of it, what it does is that it begins as like a spore, and then the spore is broken and it releases an amoeba. And the amoeba all gather together and then kind of writhe together into this like pseudo slug. And then the slug, or the slugs, I should say, writhe together again in order to create like a stalked fungus that can rupture itself and release more spores and then more amoeba. And I think that's basically what brain fluid is, or at least it's like heavily inspired by that idea. Because in the research hall, you go into the bottom and there's this like stagnant water with a bunch of corpses and stuff like that inside. And presumably that's the water that they're all imbibing in the research hall. And if you read the description of mold, it talks about like how rotten blood grows this mold on it. So in the research hall water, they have all these corpses and they're rotting. And then in the rot and the blood can grow this kind of mold. And that's presumably how they have the amoeba inside their head. And then you give a load of the amoeba to Adeline, and then that's what like puts phantasms in her head, basically, because they all come together to form phantasms. And this is a little bit more speculative, but the sticky sound that she refers to might just be like phantasm slime as they're crawling around the head, basically.
Herbert, I noticed that you didn't react when I made the Weekend at Bernie reference.
I don't know what that is. So
He's too young.
That's what I thought, and that's why you're kicked out from the stream. JSF and I can finish this together.
Okay.
The rest of this will be, we'll do the whole Weekend at Bernie's series. Film by film.
Yes, Weekend at Bernie's lore. I loved those films as a kid. They were my favorites. I don't know how many times I've seen them.
So to explain Weekend at Bernie's to anyone who's fortunate enough not to know.
You can't explain it. You had to live it.
Weekend at Bernie's was an inexplicably popular series of films in which some guys went, was it their boss or something?
Yeah, something like that.
They were looking after they had to go stay with someone really important, and they get there and discover that he's dead. So the rest of the comedy is them like with a dead body trying to pretend he's still alive. Like putting a hat on him that obscures his face and putting him next to the pool, being like, "Oh, there's Bernie."